Hello everyone, it's Livia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm just going to take the opportunity to make a video on how to do a literature dissertation. So basically it's just going to be an advice video to try and help any undergraduate students who are thinking about doing their literature dissertation. I recently got mine back and I'm over the moon that I managed to get a first, so I'm not going to make any wild claims and say that if you watch this video that's going to be your guaranteed grade. But I just want to kind of cover some of the key points and kind of give some tips where I can to try and help you avoid the potential pitfalls that I almost ended up in with my own dissertation. And just for this introduction, I'm also going to stress the importance of second year prep. So even though your dissertation won't arrive until your final year at university, you actually start preparing for it in second year. And just as a quick mention, I obviously did my degree in English and creative writing, so in second year I had the option to either pick modules that would help prepare me for a literature dissertation or the creative writing dissertation, but I opted to do the literature dissertation, so those will kind of guide your second year choices as well. So for literature at your university, you will more likely than not in second year have an option to do a dissertation prep module. Ours was called Research and Practice, and it involves starting to develop our dissertation proposals, which need to be approved before you can kind of continue building on them and carrying them out in final year. But it's nothing to be nervous about. It doesn't have to be set in stone. It's just to make sure that you are beginning to think about the right things, you're beginning to get some preliminary research done, and basically, more importantly, you're starting to come up with your dissertation title and actually deciding what you want to focus on. But as I work my way through this video, I'm just going to sort of give some advice about the different areas of the dissertation and about research and some of the things that you might want to think about and start thinking about, so you don't leave it all to the last minute and then arrive at third year sort of panicking, not really knowing what to do. So anyway, I hope this video helps, and I'll start with the first portion of this video. And if I'm glancing over, it's just because I've got my notebook here, because I've just put down some bullet points of different things that I want to talk about, so I don't forget. So for this first part of the video, how to pick a dissertation topic, there are so many aspects that are going to influence your choice. I think the most important point to stress right now is that it's very much going to be dependent on the type of specialist you have at your university. There is a lot of freedom and a lot of choice when it comes to your literature dissertation, but unfortunately if your university doesn't have a specialist in your interested field or area, more likely than not your proposal won't be approved. My case was kind of different because my university decided to carry out a lot of unethical redundancies, which meant that the area that my dissertation was in, the early modernist period, so the Renaissance period, I did my dissertation on John Milton, who is a Renaissance writer. They got rid of all the early modernist specialists in my university, so I ended up not having a specialist supervisor who's the person that kind of guides you through the dissertation process and is your point of contact for everything, basically. So I was lucky. I ended up with the module coordinator for the actual dissertation module. And although they were incredibly helpful, I did feel that this was a disadvantage, because obviously they're not going to be an expert on your author. They're not going to necessarily know the current research because it's not what they're studying. I think my module coordinator, he tended to do a lot on time and temporality and contemporary works, which is completely different to what I was doing. So it wasn't that they weren't helpful, because they were incredibly helpful, but in comparison to the lecturer that I really wanted, one of the many lovely lecturers that got completely cut, she would have been perfect because her whole field of study is in Milton, my author, and that is a large portion of her career, so she would be up to date with all the current research and so on and so forth. So I would say that when you start to think about what type of dissertation you might like to do, or thinking of your potential title, I would really encourage you to think about what kind of specialists do you have in your university, what's their field of study, what are they interested in, what are they researching. Go with your interest if you can. So really pay attention to, even in your first year, because that's where I first encountered Milton, during my first year of university, and I fell in love with his writing, and that was just a small snippet of his writing, which was one of his treatises, The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, and I just fell in love with his writing from that bit. So I would say throughout your university journey, really pay attention to your first and second year modules and start thinking about what periods of literature am I interested in. So is it Victorian? Is it Renaissance? Is it modernism? Think about forms of writing you like. Do you want to do a play? Do you want to do a novel? Do you want to look at poetry? I think the standard is that usually you would have like 3 texts to talk about in your dissertation. Once again, this depends on the length of your work. So because I ended up doing 2 texts by the same author, I did by Milton, you can potentially do a comparative essay. So you could have 2 different authors within like one time period, and it depends on what you're looking at. But you might do more of a comparative. It's always going to have a comparative element, but you might want to do that through 2 authors or just one. But because I was doing Milton's Paradise Lost, which is a long epic poem, it was 10 volumes, which then got turned into 12 volumes. So I did a 12-volume book of epic poetry of Paradise Lost. And I also did his closet drama, which was much smaller in comparison, but it was still, heavy content. So I did his closet drama, Samson Agonistes. So thinking about the forms you might be interested in exploring, it's a good place to start. And the interest and the passion component is very important for your dissertation, because you're going to be spending a lot of time on this project. It's year long, but technically 2 years of hard work, because with the stuff you do in second year, which encompasses your literature review, which is when you start to gather preliminary research and you start to find out about the critical field that you're looking into. And speaking of critical field, another aspect that's going to influence your choice is theory or critical field. So there needs to be a critical element, scholarly research to your dissertation. So you want to kind of marry the 2 together, whatever area of history or literature, whatever way you're going about it, whatever you're looking at, you need to make sure that you're linking it to some kind of critical field to not only guide your research, but to really build a strong dissertation. So the kind of purpose, once you boil it down, like what is a dissertation, you're meant to be either building on current research or querying the current research. So maybe there's been a scholarly field. I'm just going to use my example because that's the easiest one for me to talk about. But I was interested in blindness, the themes of blindness originally in John Milton's works. What my mistake was, which I'll probably mention now, was that originally I was going to look at the critical field of disability studies, which is a relatively new critical field. It was only developed in the 1980s, so it's a very new theory. But for whatever reason, I didn't fully sort of settle on that. I was kind of like, that's what I wanted to focus on, but I didn't focus on it enough. And then I had a horrific time of completely rewriting essentially the first 2 chapters of my dissertation drafts, because the first 2 attempted chapters were diabolical, and like I have a video on here about my dissertation proposal. It like completely changed. The essence of it was still there, but it completely changed. So I would say definitely determine your critical field as early as possible, because that will help guide your research, and then you won't have to do what I did in January, where I essentially spent a ridiculous amount of weeks learning about disability studies, completely redoing all my research. Basically everything that I gathered from second year was useless, or the majority of it was useless, because I had to get all new research, and it will evolve as you go through the process anyway. But definitely know what you're talking about, and definitely know what critical field you want to look at. And then you want to kind of either build on or start querying that current research. So what I personally discovered in the Milton field and disability studies that I was looking at, I learnt about ableism through disability studies. And for those of you who've never come across the term before, ableism is the preference or the favouring of able-bodied people, non-disabled bodies, and it's basically discrimination against people who have disabilities. So what I find really interesting is that a lot of research out there, or a lot of researchers in the field, even today, still very much look at Milton and look at him in an authorial context sense, because Milton himself was blind. By the time he was writing Paradise Lost in his last text, Samson Agonistes, he was completely blind when he was writing Samson Agonistes. And he went blind during the process of writing Paradise Lost, and he ended up dictating it to his daughters, so on and so forth. But what I noticed that a lot of critics were doing is that they very much have ableist views on Milton's writing, which I kind of disagreed with, and I thought or felt that Milton's work does a lot, even back then, and very sort of radical and ahead of his time. He very much challenges those notions of ableism. So, for example, even throughout history, the whole idea of how they used to perceive people with blindness, there was like a shift in history where it went from being something that was seen as like a punishment of sinners, and it was seen as a very negative thing. And it was all about the idea of loss of intelligence and like darkness, and the whole idea of like you don't know anything if you're blind, because they believed in empirical evidence, so you have to basically observe and see things to have understanding. It kind of went from that to evolving and having this shift where people started to defend blindness and say, oh, but it protects them from moral corruption because they're blind, they can't be tempted by their eyes, and all these fascinating things about ocular-centric society. So like how as a Western culture we're very ocular-centric, we put a lot of, or we used to, well actually still technically nowadays we still do as well, which is wrong, but we put a lot of value on our eyes and our sight and all these kind of ableist notions. And basically my dissertation sort of argued or put forward the notion that Milton, even though obviously these concepts did not exist during Milton's time, which I acknowledged, I very much feel that his work serves to dismantle these ableist notions of blindness, because obviously he himself was blind, but then also trying to move away from those authorial connections, because we can never truly know about authorial context, and sort of cautioning the fact that so many critics still like, oh, it's like really poignant. It's a poignant betrayal of like the fact that Milton himself was blind, and then it's like with the blind narrator, who was my main sort of focus on my one of the main characters that I focused on in my dissertation. A lot of critics kind of tend to say that he is Milton's self-insertion. So Milton is kind of using his autobiographical experience and inserting himself into his text, which I completely disagreed with. So things like that is just to get you thinking about the fact that you want to be building on the current research out there and querying, and there's not a pressure to obviously make anything amazing or new. I mean, we're only at undergraduate level and it's basically just trying your best, but if you can have a strong stance and kind of it's basically trying to show your knowledge of the wider field around your text as well. So try and, once you've decided on your text, start researching. Once you've figured out your critical field, try and see what people have said. And if you're going for a very niche area, don't worry if you can't find lots of research, because so long as you do your best to research it, you're going to find different areas and elements to talk about. And I mean, it depends on what characters you're looking at. You might find completely different critical fields, or you might find that a lot of critics haven't even started to think about a certain text in this way. So, for example, one of my peers, they were doing a really interesting piece on how everyone sort of raves about Margaret Atwood, and say how she's a feminist writer, but actually she kind of was arguing the point that yes, there are elements of her writing that could be considered feminist, but a lot of people overlook the fact that a lot of her characters still, her female characters still very much fit the archetypal submissive woman, so actually sort of challenging those notions of feminism. So it's sort of like thinking about what you're interested in and then going for it. So hopefully that helps you starting to think about how to pick a dissertation topic, but there are just so many different factors to think about. And then I'll move on to the next part of this video, which is about research. So I guess before I start talking about some of the places you can go for research, because there are so many amazing resources we can access thanks to the obviously digital world that we live in, it does have its benefits. I think an important point to also raise is that your dissertation, although you won't explicitly state these, it's always good to kind of have two sub-research questions which kind of guide your process. So your dissertation title won't necessarily be formed as a question. Like if you get the opportunity, I really recommend that you look at e-dissertations on your library, because if students have given their permission, they will only publish dissertations that have achieved firsts, and they hold them on record for a good number of years. So definitely have a look through and see what other people have done. But most dissertations will be in the form of a dissertation title. So mine was The Blind Know, how does blindness function, or how does blindness function in John Milton's Samson Agonistes and Paradise Lost. So you don't have to frame it as a question, but to help guide your research and your process, it's good to think of at least two kind of sub-areas, sub-research questions to kind of give your dissertation focus. So obviously, once again, these can change as you go throughout the process, but I think mine, or the kind of two main ones that stick in my mind, was that I was interested in how does blindness impact Milton's figures. So in Paradise Lost, I just looked at the blind narrator as a character, and for Samson Agonistes, I looked at Samson, and sort of also the impacts that sort of like Delilah had on him, or sort of used Delilah for a different point, and the chorus who kind of guide him, and sort of start applying dissertation studies theory and how the chorus are incredibly ableist, because they need Samson to function in a specific way as their hero, their foretold hero, to liberate the people. But Samson is blind, and they very much exacerbate Samson's own melancholy and poignancy about his blindness, because they're like, oh, you failed, like, oh, mirror of our fickle state, and basically label him and all the damage that does to his psyche. So it was really interesting. But basically, if you have some sub-questions, at least two, because your dissertation is huge and it's a lot of words, it's like maximum was 11,000 words. I think mine ended up being like 10,998 words. But those words fill up quickly, so you want it to be focused. You don't want to have millions of different sub-questions in the back of your mind, otherwise it's going to become overwhelming. I'm just trying to think what my other one is. Oh yeah, and my other one was sort of what is the relationship between blindness, and it kind of, rather than seeing, it became like, what is the relationship between blindness and knowing. So I was very much interested in looking at the historical side of it as well, so like the evolution of how of what people used to think about blindness, and like so I looked at like John Locke's theory, like an essay on human understanding, which was around, he was a contemporary of John Milton, like slightly after, I think he was after, or was he before? No, he was after John Milton. And sort of looking at how he had very damning ableist views on blindness, and was like, well, if you're blind, I think he had these really, really awful quotes. Like he had ones where it's just like, a blind man can only ever lead you into basically it was some sort of thing, like not a proverb, but it was basically like a blind man can only ever guide you off the end of a bridge, and like basically don't follow a blind person because they don't know what they're doing, which is wrong. But that's what they used to believe. So for research, there are many places you can go. JITSOR is a good one for journal articles. That's JTSOR. University library, so your own university library, either for physical books you can go there for, or they'll have access to ebooks, archives, newspapers, like literally anything you could dream or imagine of, your university library will probably have. I found another database which was quite useful, but I will say a word of caution about it. I discovered Semantic Scholar, which is like a database for lots of different essays, and it takes you to the links. Be super careful. It's a good website, but it was kind of tricky to navigate, in the sense that sometimes you'd click on a really promising sounding article once you read the abstract, but it wouldn't actually take you to it, and you wouldn't be able to access the essay. So I would say as a backup or for some different research, it's really, really useful, but just be careful, because it might not actually take you to the link. And Google Scholar is a good starting place, but once again, be really critical about the sources you find on Google Scholar. Make sure they're like from a reputable source, so like university level, or trying to think of different example. Yeah, university level, people who are accredited in their fields, peer reviewed. Just make sure that the standard of work you're looking at is acceptable for university level. Try and avoid, don't use student dissertations, don't use student theses, don't use other dissertations to build on your dissertation. Basically try and avoid all dissertation work, because even though they may be useful starting points to look at to give yourself ideas, really don't rely on it. Don't actually include it or reference dissertations in your work, because these are just unpublished pieces of work. They've not been accepted into academic, not proper, I can't think of the right word to word it, but they're not accepted by like research establishments in terms of like publications in a scholarly critical field. So don't rely on them for your own dissertation, because they are also like proposals in a way. They've not been like officially approved. So that's pretty much it on research. Sorry, there's hoovering going on. Just trying to think about research as well. What other points? Oh, and another good point to go to is like your supervisors. They might guide you to different areas of research. So trust their advice, and if you're stuck, maybe ask them. They might even recommend you some books as well. Okay, so the next part of this video is about supervision meetings. So, like I've mentioned in this video before, you'll have like ideally you'll have a specialist in your interested literature period or author or whatever connection or critical field. You'll have a specialist to guide your process. With the supervision meetings, it's very much dependent on you. Just like with any other essay, really. You kind of can work out your own before the actual main deadline, you can work out your own individual deadlines to send them drafts, because this is where the dissertation kind of differs from all your other essays that you've done so far at university. You have the opportunity to revise, and trust me, you're going to be doing a lot of drafting and revising. But something that's really crucial to sort of let people know now, which I wasn't necessarily aware of, like I was aware of it, but I didn't realise how it would impact me. I obviously said that I had to completely rewrite the first two draft, which is normal, first two draft chapters. However, at my university, it might be different at others, but you're only allowed to submit your draft work, chapter work once, and then send the whole thing through for one official feedback thing. Which obviously I don't know if I got my wires crossed or whatever happened. Basically, you're only meant to submit your draft chapters once, and then there was like a point or unofficial, but kind of an official mini deadline, not the final deadline, but the one before that, to like send your whole draft through. But because I was on board and on top of everything, like I usually am, and organised, I'd already sent like all my drafts fairly early on in the process. Like, I think I did like something ridiculous, like a chapter a month. I remember I wrote my like draft chapters in like a week. I just dedicated a solid week to doing nothing else but just focusing on my dissertation work. So I got my drafts done pretty quickly, and obviously not including all the revising and waiting for feedback and blah 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 blah. So yeah, be careful. Try and wait as long as, obviously don't leave it to the last minute, because you want to get as much feedback as possible, but just be really mindful about when you send those drafts, because when I sent through my full first draft to my supervisor, I did still get a lot of really useful and helpful feedback that I was able to implement, but he did mention on the chapters, even though they were completely new and different because I'd completely rewritten them, essentially he said like, oh, I'm only allowed to obviously legally read these once, so I will kind of skim through them and pick out points, but I won't go into the same level of detail as on the other chapters, but I can sort of basically give me the heads up, like if it had improved and etc, etc. And that feedback was really reassuring, actually, because it kind of, hopefully, if your supervisor is good, they will kind of give an, obviously, and as they say and stress to us, they can't even give you a predicted grade, which you wouldn't want anyway, but they can't give you any predictions in terms of that. But their feedback is really beneficial. It gets you thinking about different aspects of your dissertation that you might not have even thought of. And basically it is also playing a bit of a game, and no matter what your supervisor says, whether you agree or disagree with it, obviously a good supervisor will be like, you don't have to take my word as gospel, but if you see that what your supervisor is saying has reason, I would say 9 times out of 10 go with what they're saying, because at the end of the day you have 2 markers. One of them is your supervisor, and the other one will be a blind marker who has no idea and no inclination of what your dissertation is about, whereas your supervisor has sort of guided you through the process from afar, but they're always there if you need to send them a friendly email or arrange a supervision meeting. And there's certain hours that you're allowed to use for supervision meetings, so obviously don't go over your supervision hours. But to be fair, it sounds like hardly any. I can't even remember the number, but it sounds like hardly anything for such a massive project. But to be honest, I didn't even use all my supervision hours, but I'm just that type of student. I'm quite happy to just crack on with things myself. But yeah, just take advantage of your supervision meetings, really, and don't be afraid to ask any questions. If your supervisor is nice, no question is a stupid question. I think I obviously didn't have as much sort of need for it, just because of the aspect that mine wasn't a specialist in the field, and that's not to be mean or to discredit, because the advice they did give me was like essential and really helpful, and obviously it worked and paid off because I got a first. But just in terms of the specialism side of it, I didn't really have many questions in terms of like, oh, I don't know where to go for research. More so, I had question marks when I went to one of my supervision meetings, and then they were like, oh, I see you're trying to do this, but actually when I type this into the search box, I get loads of hits back on blindness. And I was like, well, that's not my experience, or at least there are hits back on blindness, but not necessarily the specific sort of thing that I was looking at or looking for. But basically what my supervisor was really helpful for is reminding me about being careful how you word things in your dissertation. Don't make sweeping claims. And there's a different way of critiquing and evaluating others' critical work without obviously tearing it apart. Don't fall into the trap of being like, oh, well, what they say is wrong, because obviously the people who you're writing, the critical writers that you're writing about, obviously have way more knowledge and way more experience than you. So just think about how you word things, how you engage respectfully with the critical material, but also sort of try to push your ideas forward as well, springboard off of them. So like, this critic said blah 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 blah, however in this text this, and like, you know, it's just basically about framing it. And another point is also structure, which is one of the comments or overall feedback bits that I had on mine, which I found really confusing, and I still can't myself figure out how I would have solved it. The only sort of area of criticism that I had on my dissertation was in terms of structure, that apparently my supervisor felt like I had no rationale behind my structure for my dissertation, which was very confusing for me, because I was like, well, I wrote it. But I guess what I would try and, or the only way I can think about it, is that maybe be really careful what ways you put your chapters. Make sure that it allows your argument to logically develop. I don't even know. I can't really give advice on that, because apparently my dissertation had no rationale behind the structure, but I really don't know how else I would have put those chapters. The only thing I could think of is that maybe I should have put the knowledge chapter first to sort of show that history, evolution, and then put the optical imagery chapter. But yeah, it's and then end it with the visionaries, which kind of tied everything together. But yeah, it's quite confusing. So yeah, basically just remember, it's one shot at sending in those drafts, or if you send them in early, don't be surprised that when you send in your final first full draft for that first deadline, don't be surprised if your supervisor turns around and says, oh, I can't really comment on this because I've already seen it, even though it's completely different. yeah, just to give a warning about that. And obviously do your work early, do all your research early, so you don't have a mad rush at the end, or like I did, an entire month of juggling other assignments and researching, which was fun. But we got through it, so it's fine. Okay, and the next part I'm just going to talk a little bit about the components of your dissertation. So this part I'm going to kind of condense together, because if your university is good, what they should do is give you a big online dissertation guidance booklet that kind of, and every university is different. I think they are pretty standard and same across the board, but obviously what I say might not be the case for your university, but there are kind of some elements that all dissertations have. So introduction is obviously, wow, before that you have like your title page, which usually includes like your student number, and it'll be like, this is for part fulfillment of blah 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 blah, and it has your obviously your dissertation title on it, the date of submission, or like the kind of month that you're submitting it, all that fun stuff. Then you'll have your abstract, or before that you'll have your acknowledgement. No, you'll have your abstract, you'll have your acknowledgements, you'll have a contents page, which is basically all your page numbers, and it's all very formal, and basically it's just long-winded, and yeah. You don't have to include acknowledgements, but I think acknowledgements are a really lovely thing to do. You can give thanks to your supervisors or other lecturers that have helped you, and like friends and family. And I actually really enjoyed writing my acknowledgements. It was quite fun to do. Give a shout out to your pets and things like that kept you sane. Like I thanked my mayor for not hospitalising me before I was able to submit and things like that. It was really fun. So, and then you'll have the main components. After your contents page, you'll have your main components of your dissertation. So that's your introduction. You'll either have 2 or 3 chapters, and then your conclusion, then your bibliography, and then your university will usually give you like a statement of originality, which goes at the very end of your dissertation. And that's basically just a written thing to say you either give your consent or don't give your consent to have it like published by your university library if they decide to like sort of publish it and make it accessible to other students for help or inspiration, things like that. So for your introduction, obviously introductions are always essential in essays. I can't understand when students are like, introductions don't matter, because it's like, yes they do. Your introduction is the first impression that your marker is going to get. It's for the clarity aspect. It's setting up your argument and basically saying, this is what my dissertation is about, this is what it's setting out to achieve, obviously in a much more subtle way than that, but it's essentially trying to set up the research that you're looking at, how you're building on it, how you're querying. So your introduction is essential for showing that you've conducted wide research, you know about the critical field, author, period, whatever it is, what historical, whatever approach you're doing, is basically saying, it's your rationale behind why you're doing your dissertation or what you're trying to achieve with your dissertation in a much more subtle way than that. And also obviously mentioning what your primary texts are, who your author is, all those fun things, and basically just being like, this is what's going to happen. Your introduction usually also includes a breakdown of your chapters, so what each section of your chapter is going to be about, and obviously how that feeds into your overall dissertation. Once again, try and deliver it in as subtle way as possible. I can't really give advice on that. It was quite challenging. Apparently my introduction was good, but it's really difficult to try and express to you how to do that. It's just something you kind of have to read other dissertations that have been successful and just kind of go along with it and go on your supervisor's feedback and stuff. I always find personally that breaking down definitions can be useful in an introductions thing. So obviously in my introduction I acknowledge the fact that I'm applying a very modern theory to try and give like a new nuanced reading to John Milton's text, because that's never really been done before, applying a modern disability studies critical field, obviously developed in the 1980s. I didn't go into all that detail, but basically acknowledging that disability studies is a relatively new critical field, and obviously I'm applying it to old texts to try and give a fresh reading of them, obviously not using the word fresh because that's too colloquial, but you know, just trying to sort of give your rationale. And then your 2 or 3 chapters should be the different sections or elements of your dissertation. So just to give an example, almost like think of them as the different parts of your dissertation. So I ended up having 3 chapters. Mine were to do with optical imagery, which focused on the in Paradise Lost, I was looking at like Galileo's telescope and kind of the dangers of divine interpretation, because a big part of mine was working towards my final chapter, which was the idea of visionaries, which I used in my dissertation. Once again, in the introduction, it's good to talk about terms and like how you're using them, if you're using them differently in a dissertation. So I had a term concept called visionaries, which came up with thanks to the lovely help of that lovely lecturer who was unethically made redundant because we had an early meeting in second year, which you can do to start thinking about your dissertation ideas, and it was really annoying, but she talked about visionaries and I was like, yes. So visionaries in my dissertation meant those who can access knowledge of the divine. So I was saying that their blindness was a prerequisite. The characters in Milton's works, their blindness is a prerequisite to them accessing knowledge of the divine, and kind of going against the ableist notion that if they were blind they were cut off and severed from God, because I didn't believe that. Even though Samson has his crisis and thinks God has abandoned me, God is always with him. So looking at all those kinds of ideas and the disabled body and lots of different things like that. So optical imagery was kind of looking at that, the telescope and the blind narrator, and how it's interesting that the blind narrator is the one to guide sighted readers through the process of the dangers of divine interpretation, because obviously Galileo's telescope is faulty and it doesn't acknowledge that Satan has landed on the sun, and obviously the whole idea of like, even if you have sight, you can't necessarily rely on your sight to know, to understand, which is breaking down those knowledge conventions. The second chapter was on knowledge, which sort of looked at the idea of ocular-centric society, which is Milton's society. They lived in a very sight-heavy society, and I'm trying to remember now, because in Samson Agonistes that was like looking at the senses, and like Delilah, and how his chorus, his tribe, don't acknowledge the fact that Delilah has dolled herself up. She's wearing perfume, she has this very voluminous dress, and is basically trying to win Samson's affection back, and they don't seem to question the fact that why has this woman dressed and dolled herself up for her blind ex, essentially. So yeah, and showing how that even though Samson is blind, he's learnt from his past mistakes and spiritual regeneration, and he's stronger than Delilah. I'm trying to think in terms of Paradise Lost what I looked for in knowledge. Is really bad. I can't remember, because you work on your dissertation for so long, but by the end you really kind of, you look at it so much that you almost go word blind, and off the top of my head I can't remember what I talked about, which is awful because I spent so long on it. Visionaries was kind of looking at like how they are visionaries and their status as visionaries, and sort of their access to knowledge of the divine. So for Samson, I remember that I talked about Harafa and his he's able to defeat Harafa, who is basically taunting him and being like, oh, your gods abandoned you because you're blind, and Samson is like, no, you're wrong. So, and I can't remember what I did. I think for Paradise Lost, I know I basically focused on the blind narrator. And the idea how both of them are sacred teachers. They teach individuals about morality and all the idea of sacred teachings and things like that. Because Samson uses, that was in the knowledge chapter, that was what the knowledge chapter was about, how they're teachers. So Samson uses like proverbs about like when he's having an argument with Delilah, where she's like trying to basically be like, oh, I'll take care of you, I'll love you again, which is just a lie, or at least I personally think it was a lie. And how he's like that quote where he's like, oh, I've learned to defence my ears against like adder's poison, and basically is like a proverb of like adders back then were seen as being deaf. So he's basically like, I've learned to defend my ears against your sorceries and everything like that. So basically it's just the different sections of your dissertation, the different things you're looking at. But I guess, yeah, think about the structure of those. I probably should have done that more, but to be fair, where mine was like a rewrite job, I don't think my brain had the capacity to do that at the time because I gave myself extra work to do, which was great. And then obviously your conclusion isn't about reiterating what you've done. It's driving home those points and making sure you express what your dissertation has achieved, once again subtly, but talking about how it's all come together. Another part of the conclusion is to always focus on the positives. Don't focus on the limitations of your dissertation. Obviously there's always going to be limitations in terms of word count, but something that's really nice to do in a subtle way is to sort of explain how your research could be expanded for future scholars. So for example, I think in mine there was a particular theorist that I used that if I'd had more time and word space, although I didn't need to mention that bit, but basically one of my things I talked about is that it would have been really interesting to sort of look at because I just didn't have enough words, sadly, but I really wanted to look at Manoa and Sampson's relationship, because there's a lot surrounding disability, discourse and loss. The idea that family members who are non-disabled have a disabled family member, and they often have a discourse of loss surrounding that. That's what by Walter Mayer's theory, and I thought that was really fascinating because Manoa very much goes through that, because they struggle with fertility issues to conceive Samson, and then the angels like sort of rise up and foretell his birth, and then it's like his son is a great disappointment for him in the beginning, because it's like, oh well, you failed in your quest to liberate your people, and like you've bring shame and disappointment on my house and dishonor. So I thought that would have been really interesting to apply that modern theory to that relationship and kind of look at that. So yeah, pretty much that is it. And then the only other thing I will say is that the other kind of main important bit is your abstract. So your abstract is vital. It has its own separate marking criteria. Your abstract is basically the synopsis of your dissertation. So basically condensing those many words down and letting people, first-time readers, decide whether your dissertation would benefit them. So try and have a look at what, when you start conducting your research, all the pieces of research that you have should have an abstract of some kind. And you can skim read an abstract and figure out pretty quickly whether this is talking about things you want to look at or not. And that's a handy research tip as well, to save you time. You're not going to have time to read everything. To save you time, always read the abstract first, and within the first few sentences. And if you think this isn't what I want to look at, then just leave it and move on. And a final note is that it might be different at your university, but our university gave us access to EndNote, which is a really useful online database tool to transfer over your different journal articles and all your research that you're gathering, and it's all stored in one place. And what I forgot to mention on the research bit is be very careful when you're researching. Make sure you jot down the hyperlinks URL, no matter how you do it. Put in a Word document. Be really careful. Make sure your referencing is accurate. Just be really careful with marking it down, because there's nothing worse than losing a piece of vital research and then not being able to find where you get it from. And the other thing about Semantic Scholar, an scary experience that I had, although luckily they fixed it, it wasn't an error on our end, it was an error on their end. One day I went to log in because I was starting to collect new information, and all my library was completely empty, and I was like, this is horrific. I don't need this right now. And I sent them an email, but luckily it was just an error on their system and they had it saved and they were able to get my research back, and I ended up not using it anyway. But it was quite terrifying to go on and find that your entire library of resources you've collected was empty. And I was like, this is not good. This is apocalyptic levels of bad. So I wish you the best of luck with your dissertation. If you have any questions regarding a literature dissertation, please feel free to comment below and I'll be happy to help to the best of my ability. Thank you. Bye.